Let's talk now about the endocrine system in the reproductive area. First of all, we have to talk about the female sex hormones. The main or primary female hormone is estrogen. Now, one thing I want to point out is males and females have both estrogen and testosterone, and it's the balance between estrogen and testosterone that causes the difference between males and females in terms of their various characteristics. But all humans have some level of each of these hormones. So when I call it a female hormone, that doesn't mean it's not present in males. When I call something a male hormone, it doesn't mean that it's not present in females. So the primary female hormone is estrogen, and it is responsible for all the secondary sexual characteristics of females. The other hormone that females have that males have very little of is progesterone, and progesterone is important in the preparation of the uterus for the implantation of the ovum after fertilization. Males, on the other hand, produce testosterone. It is the primary hormone in males and produces many of the characteristics that are different in males. So as we go over the major glands, we have to remember the pineal gland, which I mentioned in the beginning. If you see it on the top left here, it is behind the hypothalamus and above and behind the pituitary gland. It secretes serotonin along with another hormone called melatonin. Both of these work together to help assist in the wake-sleep cycle in humans. You've probably heard of people taking melatonin. Melatonin generally is secreted in response to a lack of light, and serotonin is released in response to daylight. And so it's what helps people stay awake during the day and then sleep when it gets dark. Thymosin is produced by the thymus. You can see the thymus gland is in the chest. It is just below the thyroid gland. It is very prominent in infants and young children, and it gets smaller and smaller as a person becomes an adult. It produces a hormone known as thymosin. Thymosin is important in the development of the immune system, which is obviously most of the development occurs during infancy and childhood. There are other minor hormones that are produced. There are several that are mentioned in the book that I'll go over briefly. One of these is called atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. You can see it in the middle here on the heart. It's actually produced in the atria of the heart. It acts locally on the kidney to cause a excretion of salt and water. Excretion of salt, that is getting rid of salt, is called natriuresis. Getting rid of water is called diuresis. And renin, which is another hormone produced by the kidney, when renin goes up, the blood pressure goes up. When renin goes down, the blood pressure goes down. All of these effects act together to decrease the blood pressure and decrease the effort on the heart. Erythropoietin is another minor hormone. It's produced by the kidney, and it stimulates the bone marrow to produce red blood cells. It responds to oxygen tension in the blood when the blood passes through the kidney. And so in times of low oxygen tension in the blood, erythropoietin is produced, increasing the amount of red blood cells. In times of increased oxygen tension in the blood, it is decreased and decreased production of red blood cells. And leptin is an interesting hormone produced by fat, and leptin is thought to be the primary hormone that tells people to quit eating. It's satiety just means that you feel like you don't need to eat anymore. And so when leptin is produced, many people think it acts on the brain and tells the brain when to stop eating. The center of the brain that controls our eating and the amount that we eat is in the hypothalamus. Now let's talk for a few minutes about abnormalities of hormones. The first of these we'll talk about is diabetes mellitus. Diabetes mellitus is a problem with insulin. Now there's two kinds of problems with insulin. You can not have enough insulin around, shown on the left here. That's called type 1 diabetes. Or your cells can be resistant to insulin and the actual amount of insulin around is increased. That's called insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes mellitus is an inability of the pancreas to produce insulin, results in high blood sugars. Type 2 diabetes mellitus is a peripheral insulin resistance. There's plenty of insulin around, but the body doesn't respond to it properly. And again, the blood sugar goes up. Another problem that has the word diabetes in it and has to be distinguished from diabetes mellitus is diabetes insipidus. Diabetes insipidus is a deficiency of antidiuretic hormone. And when you do not make antidiuretic hormone, what occurs is an inability to concentrate your urine and an increased water excretion. And people with diabetes insipidus frequently become severely dehydrated if they can't get enough water. And they spend most of their time in the bathroom going to the bathroom. Now, when we talk about the types of hormones, the hormone chemistry, there are essentially three types of hormones. The first of these is called an amine hormone. It's derived from an amino acid. An example of an amine hormone is epinephrine. The second type is a steroid hormone. It's derived from cholesterol, and an example of it is testosterone or cortisol. And then the third type is a peptide hormone, which is derived from protein, and an example of that is insulin. Now, amine hormones and peptide hormones bind to receptors on the cell membrane. Steroid hormones bind to receptors on the cell nucleus. Steroid hormones, when they bind to nuclear receptors, induce DNA synthesis and protein production. And so the action of steroid hormones is slower than the action of amine hormones or peptide hormones. And now regulation of hormone production can be done in several different ways. One is called the non-hormonal regulation of hormone production. This is when any chemical other than a hormone causes the hormone to be released. For example, a calcium deficiency will cause the PTH to be released, or a calcium excess will cause calcitonin to be released. Glucose deficiency will cause glucagon to be released, and high sugars will cause insulin to be released. So this is non-hormone regulation of hormone production. Then there's neural control of hormone production, and this is primarily done by hypothalamus, where a neurotransmitter, such that are frequently called releasing factors, here you see GnRH, which is growth hormone releasing hormone. It's a neurotransmitter that leads to the release of a hormone. And then the third is hormonal regulation. And for example, in the diagram here, you see FSH and LH. Those are two hormones produced by the pituitary. And they tell various cells in the reproductive system to produce things like testosterone or estrogen or progesterone. So one hormone causes the release of another hormone. Now, in the hypothalamus, we have what are called neurosecretory cells. And neurosecretory cells are neurons that secrete hormones instead of neurotransmitters. And we've talked about this before. The neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus produce oxytocin, they produce releasing hormones, and they produce antidiuretic hormone. Neuropeptides are hormones that are secreted, again, by the hypothalamus that cause the release of other hormones. Now, we talked about abnormal insulin production. There's also abnormal thyroid production, and this slide shows the difference between having too much thyroid around, hyperthyroidism, or too little thyroid around, hypothyroidism. Hyperthyroidism is an excess in thyroid hormone and results in the symptoms that are shown on the left: weight loss, rapid heart rate, oily skin, nail growth, and infrequent periods in women. Hypothyroidism is exactly the opposite: inadequate thyroid hormone production causing weight gain, tiredness or exhaustion, dry skin, brittle nails, and heavy periods. A goiter is a term that's used for an enlargement of the thyroid gland that can either be associated with hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism, or neither. This is what I mentioned before about the different kinds of hormone receptors. This diagram shows a steroid receptor, or a steroid hormone. A steroid hormone can pass through the cell membrane because it's lipid soluble. It's then complexed and binds to the nucleus and leads to increased transcription and ultimately increased protein production. So a membrane-bound hormone, such as a peptide or an amine hormone, causes its effect by binding to a receptor on the membrane. And it acts more quickly because of the change in metabolism that occurs. And then the nuclear-bound receptor, the steroid, which is what is shown in this diagram, causes protein production. Now, membrane-bound amine or peptide hormones act more rapidly than the nuclear-bound hormones. The last thing I'll mention is cellular response to hormones excess or hormone deficiency. And this is called either upregulation or downregulation. Upregulation is if there's a deficiency in hormone, the target cell will say, gee, there's not much hormone around here. Maybe I don't have enough targets for it to hit, and it will actually produce more targets over time, waiting for the hormone to come around. Now, with this upregulation, the problem occurs if we give a hormone after the upregulation occurs, then you can have a hyper response to that hormone. Downregulation is exactly the opposite. If there's too much hormone around, the cell says this isn't good, and it decreases its receptors to decrease the effect of the excess hormone. And this causes a problem because if you, for example, people who take prednisone or a steroid, their cells will downregulate the receptors and then they stop taking it, and then suddenly they act like they're hormone deficient. The last hormone I'll mention is called the prostaglandins. Now, prostaglandins get their name because they were first discovered in the prostate. Prostate gland in. That's the sort of ingenious way in which the scientists name these things. They have enormous physiologic effects. Most of them are autohormones or parahormones, which means that they affect cells themselves that produce the hormone, or they affect cells very close to them. They are biologically active. They produce many kinds of effects in the body, including smooth muscle contraction, inflammation, and blood clotting. They're very important in the body. And frequently we do things to try to manipulate them to decrease inflammation or to increase blood clotting or to decrease blood clotting, etc. And so you'll hear about prostaglandins all the time, and just understand that they have a myriad of different effects.